next speaker is going to be Browrig, that's right, hey?
Not here.
We're not expecting, I think Lara Bloomfield's representing them, and we're not expecting them until 2:40, is that right? 2:20, okay. So we're going to wait patiently, and if Mr. Randall turns up, we'll hear him. Otherwise, we're going to be waiting for 20 minutes. So you have leave to check your emails and messages. We had hoped that we'd have Mr. Randall on at 2 o'clock. We've managed to track him down, and he was a little confused about when he was supposed to be here, so we're not expecting him now. Next on our agenda is Brownrigg Agriculture, and I think we have Lara Brumfield who's representing them. I know it's a little bit early, and sorry to do this, we've been going yes, no, no, yes. But when you're ready, we're happy to hear from you.
Thank you.
And I think we've got a copy of your legal submissions. We got that yesterday.
Thank you. So if I could just start by reiterating what I said in the opening paragraph of my legal submissions, that is that until a week or 2 weeks ago, we had prepared evidence from Ms. Margerison, who was Brownrigg Agriculture's Resource and Compliance Manager for this hearing.
Yes.
But she can't attend because she's having surgery. So if we run into any tricky issues that I can't answer and that require a representative of Brownrigg to respond, I'd be very grateful if the hearing panel would grant me the indulgence of letting me take a note of the questions so that I can provide answers in writing, if that's
That
needed.
perhaps might be a good course of action. If we have any questions, we'll put them in writing and they can be responded in like manner.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So Brownrigg Agriculture's primary interest in Tank relates to its land around Lake Pokawa and on the Heratonga Plains. For them, like many other primary sector submitters, ongoing access to reliable irrigation water is fundamental and essential to their business, because without it, many of their cropping and general farming activities would be difficult, if not impossible, to undertake. I mean, it's self-evident, but I'm going to say it anyway because I'm here. Yields will suffer and the quality of the produce might be affected, rendering produce unsuitable for export if there isn't sufficient water to irrigate it at key times. And that, of course, can reduce economic growth and employment, at least in the short term, and I just note that those are relevant matters under your Section 32AA assessment. For Brownrigg Agriculture, they're also concerned with the management of soil water levels in low-lying areas serviced by gravity and pumped drainage systems, and that is a feature of its land adjacent to Lake Pokawa. At paragraphs 6 and 7, I've simply addressed Brownrigg's position in respect of matters raised in its original submission. So there have been some changes made, and some of those changes are accepted, or Brownrigg has made the decision to take the matters no further. But I don't think I need to say more about that. At page 2, at paragraph 10, I've just addressed the provisions that remain of concern to Brownrigg. So they had asked that clause G of policy 36 be amended so that it referred to reducing existing levels of irrigation water used to reasonable crop water needs. But the hearing report hasn't recommended any changes in respect of that. But there have been some changes recommended to Rule Tank 9, and also to clause B of the definition of actual and reasonable. Now, I know that the hearing panel will be well aware of this. The change in the 10-year period of record to the 10 years preceding to May 2020, that's supported by Brownrigg. They had also been concerned about the use of the average annual water use, which was what had been recommended in the initial hearing report, for the simple reason that in dry years, Brownrigg applies more water to crops than would be the case in an average over a 10-year period. And that's needed to sustain crop health and also yields. That's particularly important for Brownrigg's export crops, which include onions and squash. So Brownrigg is very encouraged that there has been an addendum report, a recommendation in the addendum report to change the word average to the word maximum in clause B. But there is a further concern which relates to Clause C1 and a possible inconsistency with Clause B. And that's because the former fails to refer to the maximum annual amount irrigated in the preceding 10 years. Clause C, on the other hand, refers to irricalc, and the suggestion there is that that clause could be amended or improved to refer to a maximum annual volume as calculated using irricalc. So at paragraph 18, I have set out using underlining to show additional wording, the proposed changes that Brownrigg, through me, is asking the hearing panel to make to that definition of actual and reasonable. You might see, if you just look at the opening words that Brownrigg proposes be added to Clause B of that definition, those additional words say for irrigation and non-irrigation takes. And I raise this because I have read the definition of actual and reasonable in a particular way, but other people, including clients of mine and people whose judgment and regional plan analysis I trust, have read this definition as potentially applying in a slightly different way. So the question is, does Clause B, is it intended to apply to irrigation takes as well as Clause C, or do irrigation takes simply default to Clause C? So that's why that additional wording is suggested. If the intention is, if you're an irrigation take, you can't take more than the maximum under Clause A, that's fine. And then you, on my read anyway, have to take the lesser of either B or C, and that applies whether you're an irrigation, well, for an irrigation take, B and C apply. So if that's the intention, maybe those words could just make that absolutely clear. Brownrigg had also submitted on Policy 39 and asked that it be amended to enable individual consent holder stream augmentation, mitigation or offsetting actions. The hearing report has recommended an entirely recrafted Policy 39, and that's supported by Brownrigg. In their view, it's entirely appropriate for the Regional Council to investigate options including funding for stream flow enhancement, also in consultation with stakeholders such as Brownrigg, and then to implement that preferred option within a certain period of time. And that clause rewritten, I think, has given a lot of clarity for people as to exactly how this might work. Brownrigg also sought a number of changes to Rule Tank 5, and a recommended changes come from the reporting officers, that Clause C be amended to refer to land areas greater than 10 hectares, and that's supported by Brownrigg. There's also been the rewriting of Schedule 29 so that it has a hierarchy of land uses in terms of nitrogen leaching risk. So under Rule 5, Brownrigg would need consent to move to a higher leaching land use, and my reading of amended Condition B is that it would capture any land that is newly irrigated after May 2020. But to be able to access that rule, Brownrigg also has to be a member of a catchment collective, and that's the requirement in Condition D. Now, my instructions are that the Karamu Rivers Collective has been formed, but Pokawa is not yet a sub-catchment member. And I also note that Brownrigg has commercial interests in the land outside of the Karamu catchment. So because there are no catchment collectives covering all of Brownrigg's land, it would be helpful if Rule 5 was amended to allow for land that already has a farm environment plan. It's a freshwater farm plan by another name, in place for that land. So all of Brownrigg's land in the Tukituki catchment has a farm environmental plan, which has been lodged with the Hawke's Bay Regional Council as a result of Plan Change 6 to the Regional Resource Management Plan. There was also just perhaps a typographical error that had been spotted in Condition D, which refers to a Schedule 30B, and in Appendix 1B. I'm not sure, but I actually couldn't find it when I was looking through the schedule, and maybe I'm just not looking in the right place. So to address the two concerns that I've just covered, I've suggested some amendments to Condition D of Tank 5. So the first in subclause 1 is to address what I think is just perhaps a typo. And then the second is to allow for an owner of land that has a freshwater farm plan effectively to access rural Tank 5. Provided, of course, that that farm plan meets the requirements of Schedule 30. And last but not least, a change has been requested to RRMP Rule 7. Now, Brownrigg had asked that a new Condition F, that Condition F be amended to enable drain maintenance activities, and there hasn't been any change recommended in the hearing report to that clause. Now, the rule itself refers to rivers, but many farm drains were originally natural streams, and so they would be modified watercourses under the RMA and meet the definition of river there. It's essential for farms and land in low-lying areas such as the Brownrigg interests in the Pokawa Basin. It's essential that drain maintenance be carried out as and when required. Now, of course, the protection of ecosystem values in those low-lying areas must be protected, particularly around Lake Pokawa, but not exclusively. So one way of dealing with that would be to allow farming activities that have a freshwater farm plan to specify what drain maintenance would be allowed to occur and then be allowed to carry out that drain maintenance. So for that reason, there are some suggested changes made to Clause F of RRMP Rule 7. And what is proposed is the addition of a new subclause which says that where the clearance is part of a drain maintenance program that's included in a freshwater farm plan that's been submitted to the council under Schedule 30, Section B, that clearance within 10 metres of what's essentially a farm drain would be contemplated or permissible. So if that is a change that the panel is considering making, then there may also need to be a consequential amendment to Schedule 30 itself so that it includes specifically a reference to drain maintenance activities. And I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you. I will see if we've got any questions.
I think your typo in your paragraph 24D, Roman numeral 2. Just want to put that on the record that you might want to have that corrected. That I think freshwater farm plan in place that meets the need. Is that correct?
Oh, sorry, that meets the requirements, quite so.
Meets requirements, yep. Okay.
Thank you.
No other questions?
I've got a question, but it's probably one going to be one for the staff actually, and it's just in regards to the issue of natural streams vis-a-vis drains. And I think we'll just look for some clarification in terms of being really clear that there is a difference between rivers, natural streams and drains, that and how that might apply to these particular changes that have been requested. Because certainly we had some experience in other regions where a drain is actually, it was the stream bed and has become the stream bed, even though the landowner considers it to be a drain because it drains the land.
That's right.
So it's both things, but in terms of planning, there are implications of whether it is actually ecologically a stream or it's performing as a drain for those particular purposes. So just some clarification on that would be helpful. But otherwise, it does not look like we have any questions for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you for your patience with sorting out a time for you to be heard.
Oh, not at all. I'm grateful to get it done.
We're doing one more call for Mr. Randall. Nope. Okay. And we have Apatu Farms, Mark Apatu. That's right. We'll wait till then to be heard.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to have a little break and we're going to carry on reading. As we're having the hearing, as you'll understand, we're receiving all the legal submissions for tomorrow. So we're taking each opportunity to read those, otherwise we're going to be reading them till midnight tonight. So please don't think that we're not working. how would you like to present to us today?
So on my left is Mark Apatu, the owner of Apatu Farms, and I've already been introduced.
Yes.
So Mark was going to give a short summary of sort of their operation and some of the things that they were concerned about in their submission, and I'll address the expert evidence that I presented.
Great, so we've got the short evidence from Mr. Apatu, and we've got your summary and your evidence in chief and the submission. That's all the bits we need. Great. Over to you, Mr. Apatu.
Good afternoon. My name is Mark Apatu. Together with my brother Paul, we own and operate Apatu Farms Limited. It is a second generation horticultural business farming 1,500 hectares of irrigated land on the Heretaunga Plains. The company has a permanent staff of 65, increasing to a seasonal total of 250. Apatu Farms business relies on high quality soils, warm dry summers, and the ability to efficiently supplement and irrigate crops with water. We have developed systems that have proven our ability to deliver high quality, consistent and reliable product. Our customers demand sustainability and strict environmental protocols, of which we are audited annually to ensure we meet internationally recognised standards. Our goal is safe and sustainable food and beverage production to benefit community and consumers. I generally support the overall framework of Plan Change 9 to the degree that it reflects the staged approach of improving the management of tank catchments, freshwater resources. Horticulture is critically important to the future sustainability of the tank catchments, and there are some changes required to the proposed plan to ensure that sufficient water is available to provide for that. The value of horticulture and its role in providing for domestic food supply and security and the ability to feed people in the future is not currently reflected in the proposed Plan Change 9. I'll now pass over to Tony, who will present our evidence.
I was just wondering if you could just speak to us a little bit about the horticultural operations, where the lands are, they contiguous with each other, and what types of crops that you focus on?
No, they're not. They're pretty well spread throughout the Heretaunga Plains.
Yes.
We own about 400 hectares and the balance is leased. We grow vegetables for processes like McCain's, Kraft Heinz, Sedenco Foods. So we're growing like tomatoes and onions and beetroot, sweet corn, squash. We also grow apples for the global market, and we grow grapes for wine.
Yes, thank you. Did we have any other? We might just carry on. Mr. Davern?
My summary, good afternoon, back again. My summary is very similar to what you heard this morning for Heinz Watties. It addressed, the submissions and the evidence were addressing many of the same rules and policies that we discussed this morning.
Thank you. Helpful.
So for Apatu farming, the definition of actual and reasonable, and you've heard lots about actual and reasonable, was of major concern to them. In particular, the use of an average value and the length of record that could be used to determine that number. And so in support of both using the maximum value and also support the 10-year period, but also as I spoke this morning about Heinz Watties, that all data that meets an accurate standard, and in particular is continuous and has been verified in the case of water meter data, should be used to determine the maximum value when consents are due for renewal. I used two sets of data for Apatu Farms from one of their from two of their farms, one of 8 years and one of 9 years. And as I've shown previously, that analysis showed that the average is significantly less than the maximum. And if average had been continued with, then they would end up with a use volume that was around about the 60th percentile, which means that almost in every season there would be yield and quality issues. Again, support the transfer of water permits in the same aquifer or water quality area, and for the reason that take in use is already included in the interim allocation, and it is already part of the environment, so the effects of those takes are already in the environment. And as discussed previously, the RRMP 62A and 62B, that Schedule 29, Table 2 has been struck out, so there needs to be some wording put around the transfer, and I suggest the same wording that I had this morning, and that something like the transfer does not result in an increase in NLOS, and if it's appropriate or seen to be appropriate, then adopt that 10 or 15, whatever the number is going to be, limit in terms of the increase in nutrient loss. With regard to Schedule 20, Tank 6, and Schedule 29, which deals with nutrient loss, certainly support, as others have, the amendment to Tank 6 to that recommendation that an amendment's required in Tank 6 so that all land use change is not captured inadvertently, and I support that amendment for the reasons that I set out in my evidence of paragraphs 37 to 39 of my evidence. Also, I support the recommendation for Tank 5 that the modelled average annual nitrogen loss is less than 10%, if 10% is the right number to choose, but that the average annual needs to have a time period attached to it. So, and I suggest that for most of the Heretaunga Plains, and particularly for Apatu farming, their rotation is around about a 5-year period, so they'll go, they won't be growing the same crop in the same areas every time. So if they came to transfer a consent to another area, another piece of land, then a 5-year period would be quite appropriate, because it would capture a true average of what has been going on that piece of land over that period. You heard from me this morning about Schedule 29, Table 1. I stand by my position that it's highly subjective, and in fact I see it as being redundant. If a limit of 10% or whatever the number is chosen, then I see no need for having a table specifying a relationship between NLOS risk of various land uses. Schedule 31, with regard to the Tutaikuri River, I've spoken to an ex-staff member from Hawke's Bay Regional Council. I can confirm that the bans are based on the 6 a.m. to 6 a.m. mean daily flow. Not, as I said this morning, my understanding that it was instantaneous flow. As again in my expert evidence, paragraphs 52 to 54, I analysed the mean daily flow, and it showed that there were no bans at all during the period, and there would have been no bans whether the minimum flow was 2,000 or 2,500 litres a second. However, we're aware now that there was a ban between the 22nd and the 24th of February 2017, and it's concerning that the data that's on two of the sources of data that we've looked at on the Hawke's Bay Regional Council website does not show that a ban would have would have been warranted because the flows were significantly higher than 2,500 litres a second during that 22nd to the 24th of February 2017. And for the same reasons as I outlined this morning, we've queried the raw telemetry data that is used to calculate the mean daily flow, and potentially there may have been a ban based on that data between April and May 2021 because of the number of spikes that fell below 2,500 litres a second. However, once that data has been processed, the flow never got below about 2,869 litres a second. And I just, it's disconcerting that perhaps bans have been imposed when subsequently the data shows that there would have been no reason for a ban. And happy to answer any questions or clarify anything.
And you've just included a couple of appendices there, just so I'm clear, just one with that ban period that you just alluded to.
Yes.
And appendix 2, the potential ban period, which is getting close to that 2,500, is that right?
Yeah, so this is just data pulled off the website of Puketapu, for Puketapu.
Thank you.
And in Appendix 1 you can see that in fact that between the 22nd and 24th of February the flow was above 7,000 litres a second, and yet there was a ban.
We just might see if there's any questions for Mr. Apatu or yourself.
Just wondering, those website charts, is that website, or that particular link to the flows, is that the official council place to go, if you like, for irrigators to check river flows, or is there?
You can, look, the data is, I haven't actually compared it to the data that you would just go to and go to river flows and see if they're exactly the same. I'd hope they'd be exactly the same. But I was pointed in the direction of the link to go and have a look at that, and I'd have to, someone from the regional council would have to tell us whether that data is the same.
Yeah.
But certainly, if you analyse the mean daily flows, there was no bans. And this shows
It might be a question for council staff at some stage, but because I'm aware of some councils have particular methods for determining what the official flow is on the day.
Yep.
With respect
Yes,
to.
I'm aware of that too.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
I'm still struggling with your objections to Schedule 29 and Table 1. All it is really is guidance and saying that if your land use changes from one of those categories to another, then you are likely to have to go through an assessment as to whether you're leaching more nitrogen. Particularly if you're going up the table, so to speak. I still see it as being useful. I'm not sure that it has a place in a statutory plan, however, and that's something that Mr. Coffin and I have been discussing, and we can't come to any agreement on it either.
I would agree with you. If I was running a workshop, this is the sort of diagram I would use in a workshop to say, look, this is the issue you have when you change land uses if you're on the same soil type. These are the risks that you run. As I explained this morning, my concern is that this is part of the plan and that consent application will be judged against this diagram. I would call it, it's more a diagram than anything else, and that could trigger a long process that would be unnecessary if in fact, if a 10% or 15% increase in NLOS is adopted, then you've got something objective that you can judge your change in land use by.
So if I was, which seems unlikely, if I was a second-year consents officer, I might find something like this very, very useful. I've got an application from an area that's presently 150 hectare farm that's got 100 hectares in sheep, beef, deer and goats, and they want to change that to arable use. And I would look at the table and say, well, they need to then go through an assessment as to whether there will be more nitrogen leaching or not from that, whether it passes that 10% threshold or not. So, you know, you say you would put it up in a thing like that. I'm thinking about it as a tool for somebody on the council staff who would find such a guidance potentially very useful.
You don't think if it was sitting in a guidance document somewhere?
Yeah, that's the alternative, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I don't have any issue with that.
Okay, thank you.
On the expectation that this submission would be a little different from others, and you've just pointed it out yourself because you talked to us this morning, but is there anything that stands out about this property, anything unique or different that perhaps isn't shared by some of the other properties that you're familiar with?
You mean the other two farming?
Yeah,
properties?
Upper Two Farmers.
Oh, the thing that
Well,
stands out.
I may have even asked Mark that, but
Well, the thing that stands out, I've consulted for Mark for Upper Two Farms for a long time, is the diversity that they have, and from the very beginning. I mean, they've adopted new technologies. Their water meter data was would pass all the tests that the water meter standards set out, except for perhaps a site visit by the council every year. So they're operating at a high level, and operating, and particularly in terms of, if we think about the water aspect of farming, they're operating at a level that I feel that everybody should be operating at.
maybe I'll just change the question slightly for you, Mark, because there's a question I want to throw at you as well. I guess in the time that you've been running the farm, has there been any particular things that you haven't identified here or haven't been identified in the presentation this afternoon? Anything peculiar about the farm itself? I mean, the whānau setup or the way in which it's run, things that have happened over the years that stand out for you?
Look, not that I can point a finger at, but certainly we are diverse. We do, we're growing high intensity vegetables, and on the other side, grapes. So certainly diverse in a different, requirement water-wise and nutrient-wise, within our farming business. Different soil types. Certainly, you're working with, the range on the Hiratonga Plains from heavier clays to lighter soils. And look, I just feel, if there is a change of land use, and these things can happen over time, I guess, you have an apple variety, a grape variety that might go out of fashion or flavour, and you know, change your land use. And so I guess we don't want to be, you know, hindered by, you know, plans or rules that doesn't really allow us to, you know, to change with the times, I guess.
I mean, I would imagine that your kind of farming, that people are always looking for innovation or change new things to expand their range of products. Are you in that kind of mindset at the moment?
Certainly, I think we embrace, you know, technology and innovation, and certainly always looking out for the, you know, the next best thing, you know, to enable us to, you know, better ourselves in production. Yes.
And in spite of your reservations about some of the things that are in the plans, you don't have any fears that the plan itself will undo anything that you might have in mind over the long term?
Look, I think, you know, we're at risk of, we're certainly at risk with expansion. You know, that's an issue in that there's only so much water available, I guess. You know, there's probably not too much room to move into new land and you know, change some land use, you know, outside of what we're doing at the moment.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you. I don't think we've got any further questions. Thanks very much. Thank you. Last call for Mr. Randall? No, thank you. We've got a worksheet time for outbreak. I think we're ahead of schedule again, but I'll just double check. John T. Moffat. Come along a little bit earlier, thank you very much. So, John T was going to be at 4:20. Oh, yeah, a bit earlier for us. Oh, yes. We're just going to get your original submission here. Sorry. Oh, sorry, it's John T. Moffat who was able to come out earlier. 62. 62. Mr. Moffat, thank you for coming along, and thank you for indulging us in coming a little bit earlier.
That's quite all right.
Pass it over to you to present your submission.
Okay, I just wasn't really going to get into the nuts and bolts of the plan, but I really wanted to talk about the effect that these proposed changes may have on people's lives here in Hawke's Bay. So I've got a small presentation here. So anyway, good afternoon. John T. Moffat is my name, and I've been pushed forward here today to speak on behalf of the people I work with. For their incomes and livelihoods are directly related to the productivity of the Hiratonga Plains. So please bear with me as I tell a story of prosperity and opportunity the Heretaunga Plains has given many of the people who live here. I am the son of an Irish immigrant who travelled most of the world before settling here. He saw the fertile soils and numerous waterways as an ideal place to raise a family and farm. I was born here and have spent most of my 53 years working with the soils of the Heretaunga. They've also been my home and playground. I've witnessed the change of land use, grazing and some annual cropping to more intensive horticulture and permanent crops. I've seen the intensification of housing. I've seen and used many of the older farming practices and tools, such as flood irrigation, calendar spraying, the use of harsh agrochemicals such as organophosphates, and the widespread use of fertilisers. But we have embraced the advances in agricultural science that have brought us more environmentally friendly, sustainable, efficient and productive farming practices. So that, like I did, my children too do enjoy our waterways and environment. They fish, swim and hunt in the same places I did as a child. Moffat Orchards is a company specialising in producing fresh produce for the New Zealand market. It provides full-time employment for 40 people and a further 80 employed seasonally. There are 12 families whose sole income comes from Moffat Orchards farming the Heretaunga. I am here not only to speak for these people, but for the people who work in the support industries, the children of the RSE workers playing in the villages of the Pacific Islands, and the future generations who too can enjoy and prosper from the environment of Hawke's Bay. Without a reliable source of water, we will be forced out of our homes and way of life. Growing good food is all we know and what we love to do. I wish to leave you with 2 points. If we lose a reliable source of water, it will cost jobs. Secondly, New Zealand food security. 80% of what we produce is consumed in New Zealand. We dispatch fresh produce 6 days a week, 12 months of the year. We cannot remain viable without a reliable source of water. I'd like to thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Moffat. See if we've got any questions for you.
Oh, yes, Mr. Moffat, what is your source of water?
We have ground takes and surface takes.
So your 200 hectares, it's spread out over a wider area?
It's sort of mainly Korokipo Swamp Road area.
Sorry,
Korokipo?
Swamp Road?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sort of a Mahu, Waihik, Modio.
You have no storage?
No.
Thank you.
What sort of crops are you growing, Mr. Moffat?
Apples, rock melon, watermelon, zucchini, beans, sweet corn, pumpkin. Yeah, it's all focused on the fresh market for New Zealand. And apples would be the biggest crop.
So this is all grown out of doors,
Yes. Yep.
12 months a year?
Most of the vegetables and summer fruits, we have a harvesting season that probably starts in December and runs through till, well, we're still picking zucchini today, so. And then the apple operation, well, that packs apples 12 months of the year.
Yep, thank you. So a lot of these are seasonal crops that would be harvested in sort of January through May, aren't they? The rock melons, watermelons, etc.
Correct, yeah. Yeah.
So that's the time of your peak demand use?
Yeah, and
Peak
it's,
demand for water, I should say.
peak demand would be January, February, yep. And we do use, at the moment, we're using water for frost protection.
Yeah. And I assume your take is from a bore?
Yes, most of it, but there are takes from streams too. We do have takes from streams, yeah.
So you're hydraulically connected to some of the surface water, or?
Apparently we are, yep, yes, yes.
Thank you.
Do you have any questions?
No,
Thank you, Mr Moffat.
Thank you.
Some information. But he must be quite a specialised grower if he's growing a lot now up to water markets. It's clear. They've got a really high demand for water. Gets a lot of water. Did he say stop picking zucchinis now? That's what he said. Why are they so fucking expensive? He said, I was going to say you could leave me in for it.
yeah.
Mr Painter, hi there. I know we're a little bit early. If you're comfortable with, and it sounds like you, looks like you are, happy to receive you. Welcome. Representing Johnny Appleseed, 217.
Thank you for hearing me today. So our company is Johnny Appleseed Holdings Limited, but we're probably better known for our Yummy brand of fruit, which is the largest brand of apples in the
I've
domestic
seen the
market.
sticker in the supermarket.
Yes, yes, we torment you with those stickers. And also, I think by area, we're the largest stone fruit grower in the country, but largely not in the glamour area of cherries. So just a brief background, we're an integrated family business, so my parents, my brother and I are the owners, and we've been in horticulture since 1862. We started in Stoke and moved to Hawke's Bay in 1904. So we're around about 700 hectares of mostly apples, pears and stone fruit, and we control everything right through the supply chain from the nursery production to standing in the supermarket peddling our wares and everything in between. So very integrated business. We have about 360 full-time equivalent employees, and we're basically storing and packing apples year-round. So we basically have 2 shifts working permanently year-round from 6 in the morning till 11:30 at night. So we never stop. Like Jonty, we're focused on the domestic market, about 70% of our fruit, but we export it to about 20 countries as well. My presentation will be very rudimentary for a range of reasons. Firstly, trust. I think this tank process, like no other I've seen before, has been inclusive, lengthy, robust. The level of engagement is probably the best I've seen in matters that I've been interested in, and in speaking to the people that have been involved throughout, their level of understanding and how that has grown over time has been very impressive. Having said that, when you're going to put this much effort into a process, the information is vast and complex, and I'm the first one here today to probably admit that they've given up reading it, because when I got to about 2 boxes full of paper, I glazed over. Business is tough, and this season particularly so. And so I've got to the point where the people I talk to know a lot more than I do, and I'm trusting the process and your good judgment. Likely there's some devil in the detail, but I've stopped reading it. So I did read a lot of the early papers, but it's difficult to find enough hours in the day. But a lot of respect for the people involved, and over time I've become increasingly trusting that we're going to get a sound outcome. I want to talk about water use. So mine's going to be a very basic farmer's presentation about what happens with water. And the first thing I want to say is the consenting model for water historically has been a matter of naive oversimplification. Now that's not, I don't want to use the word naive in a pejorative sense. We all assumed that we had vast quantities of water, we never had to worry about that, and so we didn't pay much attention to it. And so the consenting applications, and I'm not joking here, we were applied for on the basis of what we think we'd get, what our neighbour got, what we had historically, enough for 1 in 20-year drought, or a number we made up at short notice. And that last point, I was filling out a consent probably 10 years ago, and I had no idea what number to put down. So I rang up a bloke who'd filled out a few of these things, and he gave me a number, and I've got no idea if that number is correct or not, but I wrote it down on a piece of paper, and the council gave me more water. So I'm very appreciative of that, but one couldn't call it anything like a sensible, rational, or robust process. And that was just the way we historically perceived water here. We haven't shown it sufficient respect, and I would say we probably haven't shown the soils sufficient respect. This is an incredible growing region, these deep, fertile alluvial plains, what we thought was super abundant water, but is still abundant enough if we manage it correctly. And our productivity levels of virtually all crops are exceptionally high. While we grow mostly fruit over the years, we've been down the pathway of growing seasonal crops, and every now and then we still do that. We have fallow land, and so we've grown peas and beans and leeks and any pumpkins, any range of things to utilise the soil. And we get a lot of visitors from around the world, and they can't believe what they see, particularly when we're planting trees or putting in drainage. We had a block by the Tutaukuri where we were down 2 metres putting in some drainage, and I took a German guy in there, and he looked down and he said, "Where does the topsoil finish?" And the answer is, that close to the river, it doesn't really. It looks pretty much the same all the way down to 2 metres. And the productivity we get out of that block, because of the quality of the soil, the depth, the relatively high water table, so you need the drainage, but also the capillary action, providing an almost perfect water supply, has given us some yields in there that when I tell my counterparts in South Africa and Chile and Italy and France and the USA what we're producing, they think I'm lying. But truly this is, with our benign climate and our soil and water and the high intensity of sunlight, we can do things here that nobody else in the world can do. We learnt a lot from the Twyford water bans in 2013, and I think some of these things we kind of knew, but we had them reinforced. There's no absolute right to consented volumes of water, and I think that's something that the rural community accept. You can't have an ironclad guarantee on anything because there are too many variables. And those consent numbers are, to be perfectly honest with you, not a useful proxy for anything. They're utterly meaningless. And there's a lot of talk about water being over-allocated. Well, it possibly is on the consent numbers, but the numbers don't mean anything. They are not sound basis to make any assumptions. So back then when we had that water crisis, the consumption of water in Twyford was around about 25% of the volume that was consented. So a crisis can occur at a relatively low level if you have a low flow year or dry year or whatever it might be. The other thing we learned is preserving the capital stock is critically important. If you go from complete availability of water to no availability of water, trees die. And you're probably 5 or 6 years before you get those areas back into production. So at the very least, you need to be proactive and have soft stops and have enough water to preserve the capital stock. You can move a flock of sheep to somewhere else, but it's very hard to move an orchard, and watching it die is not something that people cope very well with. We didn't lose a lot of trees, but we did lose some. We don't actually farm in that area, so we were okay, but I certainly saw some of my colleagues suffer. And I think that what we learnt was, and it's true of regulators everywhere, that you can end up sometimes the regulation is an end in itself, and they have a limited understanding of what happens on farm, and I think that's everybody's fault, and something that needs to. This process has been very cooperative and engaged with the stakeholders very well, but historically, I have been told by, it's by one person at the regional council, it's not our job to be helpful, it's our job to interpret the Act and to regulate. And I actually think you can achieve both things if you're open enough to doing so. And there's some very fine people there, and I think that we're on the pathway to achieving that end. Water use modelling needs to consider a lot of things. And I think the council have done a great job, and there's a great deal more information on the flows and the head levels and the river levels and the aquifers than we had 10 years ago. But what we don't want to do is move from one oversimplified system to another. And some other regions have done this. They've basically said, you grow apples and therefore this is how much water you can have. But it's not quite that simple. Certainly the land use, the growing systems, the types of yield you'll get, the rootstocks you're on, the soil type, there's a lot of variables. They're not impossible to get your head around, and I don't think they are, dramatically difficult to comprehend, but you do need to take account of them, and I'm going to go through a specific orchard to give you a little bit of an idea of that. And the other thing is the seasonal rainfall variation. I mean, somebody mentioned from the council a while ago maybe they should have a use it or lose it approach to water, but of course if the water falls out of the sky, we don't need to take any from the ground, and that happens quite regularly in New Zealand. Our rainfall here is on average very stable, but seasonally, particularly in terms of timing, extremely variable. So land use is an interesting thing. This is we're making a transition here from a old apple orchard to a new one, and we've mulched the trees, and so you're getting about 6 of these big trucks per hectare, and people think that this is a better solution environmentally than burning them. I don't think it is. The mulcher is 850 horsepower and chews through diesel like you wouldn't believe. And then there's a lot of transport and energy involved in dealing with what's left over. So I suspect it's got a significantly larger carbon footprint than efficient burning, which is what we're doing here. So this block is a block on Longlands Road. It's about 25 hectares. And over the last 7 years, we've chipped away at replacing the entire orchard. And that's pretty important to consider, because there's been an assumption, obviously, with the water consents that land use is stable, and it isn't. It changes significantly. And so over this period of time, we've had a number quite an area of land fallow, or have been doing other things with it, potentially growing other crops and changing the types of growing systems we're using. So the water, the actual water usage, if you looked at it, you're going, there's something not quite right here. And we're in a transitional phase in terms of land use. So that has augmented things somewhat. So this is one of the things that we usually do now. We have at least one fallow year where we don't sterilise the soil anymore. For the most part, we're using mustard seed, which we turn into when it's in flower like this, and it basically creates mustard gas and sterilises the soil. So in this particular block we used, it's about 20% of the land area in mustard, which we are just ploughing in today actually. And it's, this is the third crop with this really long growing season here. We grew through 3 crops of mustard in it this year. You need a bit of luck for that. Usually the first and last one don't need any irrigation, but the one in the middle sometimes through that, the height of summer does need irrigation. So out of those 3 crops we actually only irrigated once, so not a lot of water used in this area. But having said that, then we planted, this is the area we did 2 years ago, and you can see little 2-litre trees that we're growing, and they look a lot different to the orchards of the past, the semi-dwarf orchards with 5 or 6 metre trees. So we're attempting to grow a fruiting wall with very even light interception. You've got dwarfing rootstocks with a much smaller root bundle, and so these need a little bit of water quite often, whereas the larger trees, we often did them with irrigation pipes, and they needed a larger amount of water less frequently because of their larger root area and deeper roots. So you see this block here, we used to irrigate with sprinklers, and this now has the pressure compensating emitters, basically just a dripper tape there to supply water to the trees. So we'll irrigate more often, but in smaller quantities. So certainly we'll change our water use even though it's still apples. And so this is what one of those blocks looks like when it's up and running. Very thin canopy. They don't really look like apple trees. They look like a hedge along your grandmother's back fence. So that very even light interception gives even maturity and more efficient harvesting. But these are the types of growing systems that everybody's moving to with a view to being robot ready, so that they, we've obviously got some real labour challenges in this country. The local cafe can't get a barista, and the supermarket can't get anybody work in the produce department, and the local building company is struggling for a labourer. Everybody's short, 4.7% unemployment. It's a good news story, unless you're one of those people that just can't find anybody, which is the enviable position we're in at present. So these, at the very least, this fruit can be harvested on elevated platforms, so you don't have to go up and down ladders, and we're hoping that ultimately it will be able to be harvested by robots. The challenge for robots is occlusion, that is the leaves and branches covering the fruit so it doesn't quite recognise them or recognises whether they're ready to pick or not. So it has to be able to see everything. So we're moving to these systems, and this is what Wellington is saying, you must innovate. Having said that, if it carries on like this season and I can't get labour and I'm putting up a whole lot of red ink, nobody's going to lend me any money to innovate. So we've got a bit of a catch-22 there, but this is certainly the direction the industry is going. The old trees, I took a photo of this old Granny Smith tree this morning, planted in 1967. It's our oldest sensibly commercial block and probably needs pushing over, because trying to get people to climb up ladders and pick these things these days is not so appealing and really difficult to do. So this is where we were, and we're making a transition to a better place. But the life of an apple tree is typically maybe 35 years, and this is the oldest block, but it takes a long time. You know, you're an aggressive grower if you're changing your orchard by about 7% a year. It's a very expensive process, and you can't afford to get rid of your entire revenue line while you do it, or you never come out the other side. So it is a slow process at an enormous capital cost, and generally we're about 4 years to cash flow break even and about 10 years to investment break even when you do a redevelopment. So it's it's a slow workout. This block down Longlands Road I mentioned has changed significantly since 2013 to 2021. Over that period of time, I think in 6 of those years we've redeveloped a portion of it, and you can see the chart on the left has some Royal Gala and some Oregon Red Delicious and some Fuji and Braeburn, mostly old varieties. They were planted between early 1980s and the late 1990s. And over on the right-hand side is all of the trees we have planted since 2013, all different varieties, particularly Ambrosia and Midiaskia, which is actually Sweetango, two significant new varieties getting premiums in the marketplace. So we've planted some more Granny Smith because those old trees have got to go, and there's still a demand around the world for those. We've got 18% of the land which is fallow, which is in that mustard, which we will plant in a few weeks' time, and the project will be complete. But it's certainly that process of planting those things will spend basically a decade with probably mostly negative cash flow from that block. So it's made a transition from those old, large, woolly trees to these modern dwarf fruiting walls. And so ultimately your water demand on this new orchard is probably going to be slightly more than it was on the old one, but the watering regime will be more little and often, so probably less taxing in terms of your 7-day take or anything like that. So it's a slightly different dynamic that they've got. But with the smaller root bundle, you also have more exposure to potential drought. They don't survive so well through dry patches.
Just in terms of that last diagram, the changes in the varieties, is that mostly driven by productivity and yield, or demand for particular types of apples? Just seeing the difference in,
It's driven by
Oregon and those.
It's driven by vision, really. Yes, these apples get bigger prices. When we first started planting them, we weren't sure they were going to do so, but the market feedback has given us confidence to plant more, certainly. Okay. But I think it's the biggest driver has been the style of the trees. If you're short of labour and you've got 6-metre ladders to climb, and the guy over the road's got some nice dwarf little trees on a platform, all of the pickers are going to walk over the road. So I think being attractive as an employer, it also is significantly more efficient. About at least 25% of the time when you're picking with a ladder is wasted. It's going up and down the ladder and moving the ladder. So if you can do so on a platform where you just move along it on an elevated, at a static level and pick, you save some of that time. So about 25% is the labour cost you can save in harvest, which is becoming more important and very attractive to us. The problem is, of course, the platforms, well, the fancy ones are 150,000 each, and I probably need about 70 of them. So there are some headwinds there, and I think that hopefully over time that cost comes down, and I think we need simpler platforms than some of the machines that are being presented to us. But even on these dwarf trees, we're operating these things on basically a 4-foot ladder. There's a guy in Italy, Alberto Doragoni, whose vision is for a semi-pedestrian orchard. So essentially you have what amounts to a milk crate that you drag along the road with you, and you stand on that. So the trees are only about 2.2 metres tall, and you just stand on a step to pick the top of them. Or you put the platform through and pick the top metre of the tree, and the rest is done from the ground. So trying to be more labour efficient and more attractive to labour is a driver. And tree age too. You end up with some dead trees and some disease and less attractive varieties. So there's a range of factors, but yeah, it's certainly the economics of these young blocks, once you get them going, are much better than the old production systems. More productive, lower costs, better varieties. So water use, which you'll see that we've got our take limit at 50 litres a second up the top there. Very big well on this block, only one well for the 25 odd hectares. And mostly it was using sprinklers in those older days and drip irrigation more recently for most of the block. But there are some fascinating things here. There's some years that look very similar, but if you look at what's going on with some of these, you can see that, and this is very common, the actual take is sporadic and at a much lower level than what was consented. And that's because we asked for and got far too much water to start with. You'll notice the the 3 years worth noting are 2019, where it was a very wet December in Bayview, where we were growing stone fruit. We got 3.5 times the average December rainfall, and so we didn't irrigate out there at all. All of our takes in that area say zero. If there may have been a small irrigation, in March or something, just as before the trees went into winter, but certainly during the season we didn't irrigate. We're harvesting there mostly pre-Christmas or at the latest early January. So there's a lot of blocks in that 2018-19 season where we used little or no water, and this one's probably, never really got over about 6% of the permitted take. And then we see the next couple of years, the Regional Council aware of this. You see we took more than we were supposed to in 2020. One of the anomalies that people have discovered recently, a lot of people in the district, on the water meters there is a number, and in a little print on the right-hand side of it is this little ×10. And a lot of the industry, including my guys, gets a bit dusty there and they just write the number down. But actually they're missing a naught. So we were misreporting some of the data. This data is right. We were misreporting it and taking too much because a lot of people in the district didn't see that little ×10 at the end of their meter. So you see 2 very, very hot, dry years, unusually so, but preceded by a very wet one. We got huge amounts of water until, in that 18-19 year, until about mid-January. And that pretty much in Hawke's Bay soils topped us up for the season. We didn't really need to irrigate very much after that. That hasn't been the case the last 2 years. Very hot, dry seasons that have been quite challenging. But going back in history, I would have said that 2013 was also a very hot, dry year, and 14 not much different. So you can see that you could argue that if we'd managed things better in those dry years, we still could have coped with half the maximum take that we were consented for. So we're not probably managing water very well. These are those 2 years. The most recent one, 2021, is at the top, and the 18-19 year is below that. And you see that they probably put a little bit of water on in 18-19 at the bottom there in the spring, and it's important to have some water at that time, particularly for the uptake of calcium, which is a critical element for making good fruit. You get a lot of physiological disorders like bitter pit if you don't get enough calcium, and calcium, as it is with a lot of things, regulates cell wall and membrane integrity, and it competes with other cations such as potassium and magnesium, which are more readily taken up. So they're keeping the irrigation right around that bloom or early fruit set stage is important. And after that, it rained in December until we got to about mid-January, and I see they put a little bit of water on something in February there, and this particular block, that's where soil comes into it. At the front, it's class 5 or 5S Twyford silt loam, really amazing water holding capacity. It's the best soil in the world in my view. And as you go to the back of the block where the Karamu stream is, you're going into 4S, which is a light soil, predominantly sandy, and so you haven't got very good water holding capacity, but you've got exceptionally free drainage. So if I was a guessing man, I would say that they were irrigating on those sandy soils down by the river. But almost no take. You could make an argument that we could have survived with no water that year, and there was blocks that year we didn't irrigate at all, and there are seasons where the minute we get the irrigation pipes out, it starts raining. So it's certainly a volatile climate when you're an island in the Pacific. But you see even a heavy water use year, the most recent one, some of those peaks probably not necessary. You can manage the irrigation over a flatter curve than that. Possibly the manager had a couple of days off. So it was still well under the potential take, and limited time. The crops also, depending on what you're growing, will determine when you're going to water. So with a lot of field crops, you're going to want to have some water. We like to actually see when the rain's coming and plant then, and then they get away pretty well. But yeah, it's sporadic, and from year to year changes quite significantly in terms of the crop and when you're actually applying the water. So I think that our history is, from the territorial authorities' perspective, has been naive oversimplification, but we didn't need to be cleverer than that. And from the growers' perspective, poor management and very poor understanding of the dynamics of water, because again, they thought they had plenty and they didn't have to worry about it. So we have to change the culture of our industry, and we need a rational framework for doing that. And there's a huge opportunity for improvement. If I went and asked my guys, we've got 7 orchard units. If I went and asked any of my managers, how many cubic metres of water did you use on this block last year, they wouldn't be able to tell me. They go down there mechanically and read the meter and fill in the forms, but their brain is not engaged because they're still working on the basis they've got plenty of water. And given our generous consents, they're probably right. So we need to improve that, and as an industry we can, and we've got a good track record of doing so. We made a transition from calendar spraying to the IFP program in the 1990s. Somebody mentioned to me that we reduced the volume of chemical use by 80%. We certainly decreased the level of human toxicity. Nobody believes this number, but it's true. It was a study done by a CRI. We reduced the toxicity of what we were doing by 97% by moving away from organophosphates and other pretty harmful products to insect growth regulators and employing pest and disease monitoring, pheromone traps, a whole lot of different strategies to manage production. So when we were using products, we were using things that were targeting specific species and had very low levels of toxicity for beneficial insects and for humans. So that reduction in toxicity by 97% was tremendous, and we achieved it over 4 or 5 years. What we did was get some pretty good heads together in the industry, along with the scientific community, and we worked together to really create a revolution over 3 or 4 years. And in my view, that needs to happen with water as well. And the industry is, I think, ready to be involved in that, and they understand that we have such a precious resource here in Hawke's Bay that we need to manage it well. And as I've said at the beginning, we haven't shown sufficient respect for either the soils or the water, and that needs to change. So I'm very positive about the tank process. I'm always nervous that we lurch back into the world of oversimplification, and because everybody wants basic rules to run resource management issues. But we certainly need the industry engaged and to develop best practice models. Our IFP manual is quite a thick document that gives advice on managing any range of things. And overseas, they have a section on water use, and we have the little tab for water use. And when you open that section, it's empty. We haven't developed that area of our business at all based on the assumption that we had plenty of water in our consents and almost a limitless supply of it. So we need to change in that regard, and I think there's still plenty of water to go around, providing we put that consenting number in the bin. The best thing to be considering from a regulator's perspective is probably, the peak annual usage of any user and maybe a rolling 5-year average, something like that, which gives you a better picture for what's actually happening rather than some spurious consenting number. So thank you for your attention, yes, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Painter. I just realised we've got a presentation. I don't think we've got a copy of that. It would be useful if you were able to send us a copy.
I have some here.
That would be great. We'll see if we've got any questions for you.
Mr. Painter, thank you for that. As I understand your submission, what you're saying is there should be a 2-tier approach to water allocation where, regardless of what's going on, we should get enough water to allow our crops to survive as a very basic allocation, and that should be in all circumstances, and then over and above that, we should have actual and reasonable allocation, if you like, that would apply all the rest of the time. But in those extreme situations, we need enough for our crops, our grapes, our apples, whatever it might be to survive. Is that what you're saying?
That is what I'm saying, and over and above that, the industry users need to work together where they have over and under supplies of water to manage those. So some sort of cap and trade system or some sort of pool of availability that can be allocated equitably is important. But absolutely, those are the two levels at which water needs to be available.
Thank you.
When was your consent granted and when does it expire?
Ooh, it's a very good question. We've had a lot of renewals just recently, but we have, I think, 63 wells in the company. So every year we have some that are coming up for renewal, but we certainly have some lumps. And right now there's I think there's something like 21 of them that have either been renewed in 2020 or will be renewed this year.
So the graph you showed with the water demand, the annual water demand versus your maximum rate of take, that's across all of your consents?
No, that's that particular block. So that block, I think, has a 10-inch well in it, very large well. So that's the largest well in the company. It's quite a nice block to look at, though, because we've got a lot of blocks. I've got another one just down the road of a similar size. It has 3 or 4 wells. I think we only use 3 of them, but then, collating the data and showing what's going on becomes difficult. Whereas this block has a very large 10-inch well that we put in the early 1980s, and it services the entire orchard. So it's a nice one for illustrative purposes.
Right. So it was granted in the early 1980s?
Early 1980s originally. It will have been renewed a couple of times since, and I'm quite sure that we applied for what we were originally granted and received it.
Okay. Thank you.
Any questions? No. Thank you, Mr. Painter.
Thank you.
Mr. Davidson. We're just going to take a 5-minute break. We haven't had a little break for a while, so we're just going to have 5 minutes and then we'll hear you. How's that? Thank you. we've got your submission in front of us, and you are our lucky last
I won't keep everybody waiting too long then.
for today. Thank you. Over to you.
Okay, pretty much a lot of what Mr. Painter was just saying is pretty much where we are as well. We can't be growing the big old trees, etc. The change in variety. Where we do differ in terms of the Yummy operation is they are vertically integrated, where we are just a small-time orchardist. So 2 years ago, the new owners bought the orchard, which it was initially 22 canopy hectares. They had no background in apple growing before that, but have been involved in kiwi fruit and avocados, so are venturing into this. So fortunately, we have the apples behind us, but we've taken an approach of very aggressively changing the orchard over to these new systems. The orchard already had 3 hectares that in relatively recent planting of what we would call a sort of modern planting, hedgerow style platform ready planting. In the last 2 years, we've done a further 7 hectares of that, and we're doing a further 1 hectare of that this year, redeveloping that, which clearly means that as a standalone orchard, we are definitely not washing our face, and the kiwi fruit is carrying us quite extensively. We have also acquired another orchard on Crystal Road around the corner, which is another 13 hectares, of which we will be redeveloping 7 hectares of that this year again into a modern orchard. Now, what we've already found, between the 2 blocks, we have 6 different consents on 6 different wells. Now, I'll just use one of the consents for an example. The one, what is the number? I think it's bore number 1570, which allows for irrigation of 4 hectares. We've redeveloped 3 hectares of that, and we have 1 hectare that's still in what would be considered old school planting, 5-meter rows very far apart. Roots all the way to China. They don't require a lot of water. But just what I've been finding now, having redeveloped that 3 hectares and the water requirements of that, where we're looking to do 25 to 30 mils a week in multiple waterings, in 3 different waterings. And this will probably continue because of the nature of the rootstock and the dwarfing rootstock. It will be right through the span of those trees' lives. Obviously, we're not going to have to water if we get the rain at the right time. But in that sort of dwarfing rootstock, it's the little and often philosophy. When you've only got your roots in that top sort of 300-400 of soil, it drains through pretty quickly, so we've got to keep the trees fed. So what I found on that consent is if we had to redevelop that other hectare into a modern planting, that consent would not cut it as it stands at the moment. But it does also show up some of an anomaly of the variances between the consents, because it allows us 13.5 litres per second and a 7-day take of 1,104 cubes, but it doesn't give us a yearly total. But I mean, even just to keep to that 7-day take, it keeps it very, very tight indeed. Just to get those 3 hectares and then even just the one, I've got to do quite a bit of juggling. Being a small operation, we're just, up until a year ago, it was me and one other. Now with the new orchard, we've got an extra 2 full-timers, and I've taken on another guy more on a casual contract, which will probably turn out to be permanent, but that is, staff is our biggest issue, and water is going to be that next. With us developing all these other blocks as well, our demand on the existing consent, and there does seem to be an anomaly between the 7-day takes and the total volume, in terms of we could probably give a little on the overall volume, but possibly need some more on the 7-day take. Yeah, it's going to be a juggling act from here forward, and being the one who does monitor the meters and entering that into the water meter system for the council, I am quite familiar with that. And one of the things Mr. Painter brought up was the little times 10 on the meters. I have discovered that not all meters are created equal, and some of them are times 1. And there does seem to be a bit of a discrepancy, so, it's difficult. Yes, so I think we're saying going forward, I think we all accept that there's going to need to be some adjustment and give and take, but a one-size-fits-all, I tend to agree with that. We kind of almost need to break it down to the existing consents and horses for courses, where we've got to make sort of what fits to those different bores.
Thank you, Mr. Davidson. Did you want to, we happy to take questions?
Yes.
So can I just clarify with your existing consents, do they have an annual volume on them, or is it just a weekly volume and a maximum rate of?
All of them have, actually, some of our new ones on Crystal Road also, yes, we've actually got a bit of a change of consent because of the way it was structured. With the one only has a frost consent, and the other one has a frost and irrigation consent. So it's a 100 mil bore and a 200 mil bore. And now with the redesign of the irrigation system, we've sort of requested, well, can we get, not affect the overall take, but can we get the draw off that, have the 200 mil bore also included in that frost and irrigation for the consent, which, as far as I can assess taking over, it is how it's been used in the past. So quite how that has worked, I'm not quite, I'm sort of getting up to speed with that, because my monitoring of that Crystal Road block and those consents, I've only just taken over that. So I'm not too afar as to where they lie. I think that one, I'm not sure, it doesn't seem to have an overall volume. Oh, sorry, it does. It has a 12-month year, so it would just be the one that's the 4 hectare that doesn't have a year total. All the rest have that 7-day take, and then also the number of litres per second that we can draw off it to get everything irrigated.
So your consents allow for both irrigation and frost protection?
No, just that, just on that bore. It's a bit of a strange setup in terms of where the pump shed is. The 200 mil bore's on the one side of the pump shed, and the 100 mil bore's about 3 metres away on the other side. So the 200 mil bore has frost only. The other one has The 100 mil bore has frost and irrigation. So it is and they kind of feed into they both feed into the same thing, so I don't quite know. Yeah, it's sort of, it makes me a little nervous when we basing things on past usage.
The rate of take you require for frost fighting, how does that compare with the rate of take you require for irrigation?
Let me just, the frost one, it's massive. Because that 200 mil bore virtually covers the entire orchard in one hit. So if I can just, 12 months, no, that's not the consent it's on these ones.
I suppose what I'm really trying to get a feel for is on a per hectare basis, do you require more water for frost fighting than you do when you're irrigating during the summer seasons?
I don't think, no, we're not going to be requiring a lot on the frost. I don't think, because we do have a new windmill on that block, and so we'll probably only be looking, the windmill probably doesn't quite cover the full area, and we'll probably just be running the frost on the extremities of the windmill's boundaries, and then it's just a pulsing on various sectors for so many minutes at a time, just to give it that little extra, raise the temperature just a touch.
And just, is there a number of times a year or days a year that you need water for frost fighting? Is there any rule of thumb there, or is it
No,
highly variable from year
it
to year?
can be so variable where you just don't, you can burn through a few thousand litres of diesel on those machines over a 2-week period and not touch it again for the season, kind of thing. It's just, but yeah, there's just, it's almost like the irrigation itself. If you get a very wet season, well, obviously you need a whole lot less turning on the pumps. But yeah, it's...
Okay, thank you.
Yes, thanks, Mr. Davison. You spoke about how much water a new block of trees requires, and then said you had a very old block. What's the difference in water demand for the new blocks versus the very old? I think you talked about 25 to 30 millimetres a week, or up to 25, 30 millimetres per week for the old blocks. What do for the
no,
new blocks, what does the old block require in comparison?
I'd say that 25 to 30 mils a week is for the new style planting.
Yeah.
The old ones with these very wide spacings and absolutely massive root bundles would be way less than that, and only in a dry season. I mean, it wasn't too many years ago now where we didn't irrigate the entire season, but the orchard was predominantly in that old school planting, and then I think it was the very next season all the wells ran dry, and first time we didn't even have positive head to get into to feed into the house, and so hand primers had to be installed on all the pumps. Yeah.
So over a few years, the amount you would put on those old blocks might be a third of what you put on the new ones? That sort of ballpark?
Yeah, probably. One good water, get a 40, 50, 60 mil on would give you 6, 7, 8 weeks, with the depth of those roots, and I'm talking trees, our older blocks, in our Granny Smiths, which go back to 1979, so they're big old trees, but pretty much as a small grower, where Mr. Painters, they differ in operation in terms of the varieties they can carry because of the vertical integration, where they can afford, they actually need to be growing some of those lesser varieties, the Galaxies, the Braeburns, the old standards. We really can't be, if it's not if it's not earning at an absolute minimum of $35 a carton, we can't grow it. It's as simple as that. And so while we still have a fair bit of Granny Smith, they're still paying pretty well, but because there's so little of it left now in the bay, it represents so little. So we'll persist with those for now, but we're very much into the new varieties, the Dazzles, the Envies, the Rockets. P Queen is still a good winner. We can live with Fuji for the moment, but
So if you're looking at water use, you've planted a new crop, and I'm going to be diagrammatic here, and you've got quite high water needs. After how many years of those new crops does that water demand taper off? Is it 3 years? Is it 5 years? Is it 10 years?
you mean in terms of the modern planting, our new style planting?
Yes.
Especially in the dwarfing rootstocks, they will only go to a certain level. So you're pretty much flatlining on where you start is where you continue.
So it doesn't drop off much over time?
No, because of the closeness of the planting and the inter-tree competition, they're fighting each other so hard so that you're not going to find blocks with trunks like this, like the picture Mr. Painter showed us. And that is, we get the trick to contain the vigor. The trees are sort of almost fighting each other for that, what's happening below the soil, which is why we sort of need that, need to be irrigating as we do with these new style plantings.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Great.
That's our last presentation for the day, and I understand Council had a few questions for us. Oh, sorry. Yep. I have I'll just give you a quick heads up. I'll give you more of a shopping list. We'll probably wait till end of tomorrow because we've got the wine growers tomorrow, and I'm sure there'll be some issues that we'll need to discuss then. But just give you a heads up where some of the things I've just noted down at the moment. We're interested in understanding the numbers of consents that might be required as a result of proposed plan change 9. That's an issue, and we're just having a think about capacity to actually administer the changes.
There we go. Is that water takes or specifically?
We're thinking specifically about water
Yes.
takes, yes, allocation. Yep. This next one, this isn't something that's been coming up specifically during the submissions we've heard thus far, but it's something that's in the back of our mind. Table 26, and this is in regards to water quality, and it has this quite useful colouring in blues, yellows, greens, reds. And when we've been going through the list and we see where the reds are, specifically geographically, it seems to, certainly to us, that it makes sense that the interventions will focus on the red parts rather than broadly right across all of the catchments. And so just wondering if you had a view in regards to that, where proposed plan change 9 sits.
There is a map in one of the plans, I think,
Yeah.
in something, but I think that relates to sediment loss, as I recollect.
I was going to say there are a number of maps with priority.
And looking at where the problem areas are, particularly in relation to the source of contaminants.
Yes, and there seems to be a common theme there.
Yeah, the priority maps are probably something that you might want also to have a look at alongside the Schedule 26 water quality.
Yep, sure.
So where we want to focus our attention, as it were.
And this next comment, this is something that was raised today, but it's been something I've been certainly thinking about since yesterday, was whether the council had put any thought or consideration to guidelines for the implementation of proposed plan change 9. And there's been a few matters that have been raised, like for instance the Schedule 29, should it be in the plan or outside the plan? But the first question is, has there been any consideration about guidelines of the implementation of the proposed plan change? And you would have heard submitters talking about the complexity of not quite understanding where they fit in the world, but that'll be across the board. And this is a very specific question. We talk about nuts, in particular chestnuts, and just wondering if there is a surrogate for chestnuts. Perhaps we're going to have Hort New Zealand come along, and we'll probably ask them that question if they've got any information regards that. Yeah, it was just interesting, and I'm sure there might be other particular crops that aren't identified in the table at the moment. But certainly I'm not suggesting that there should be a list of all of them, but there might be a useful surrogate to represent them. So this is just some of the thoughts we're having, and we can clarify those probably later tomorrow. Other than that, unless we've got any other questions, we'll adjourn for the day, and we'll see you tomorrow. We've got, let's have a look. Oh, we've got wine growers in the morning, right through until just before lunch. Delegates, John Palmer, Aotearoa Fine Wines lunch. And then we've just got a few submitters after lunch, and we're planning at this stage to finish at 3:20 tomorrow afternoon. And then a very full day on Friday. And just looking to that Friday, I think we now no longer have any constraints around flights. We're all going to be here for the full day on Friday, unless that changes, and then we'll be quickly trying to change flights on Friday afternoon. But was there anything that you need to let us know in terms of arrangements for this Friday?
Transfer a couple from Friday on to tomorrow. We're going to finish early tomorrow.
Well, I can't hear you, Nicola, sorry.
What you're saying, they should have somebody on the phone.
That's okay.
That's good.
Yes, please. Yeah, that would be helpful.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you tomorrow.